Welcome back. We're going to be getting started on part 2, The Smoke. Leaving. Tally left at midnight. Dr. Cable had demanded that no one be told about her mission, even the dorm minders. It was fine if Paris spread rumors. No one believed the gossip of new pretties anyway, but not even her parents would be officially informed that Tally had been forced to run away. Except for her little heart pendant, she was on her own. She slipped out the usual way, out the window and down behind the recycler. Her interface ring remained on the bedside table, and Tally carried nothing but the survival knapsack and Shay's note. She almost forgot her belly sensor, but clipped it on just before she left. The moon was about half full and growing. At least she'd have some light as she traveled. A special long-range hoverboard was waiting under the dam. It hardly moved when she stepped on. Most boards gave a little as they adjusted to a rider's weight, bouncing like a diving board, but this one was absolutely firm. She snapped her fingers and it rose under her, steady as concrete under her feet. "Not bad," she said, then bit her lip. Since Shay had run away 10 days ago, she'd started talking to herself. That wasn't a good sign. She was going to be completely alone for at least a few days now, and the last thing she needed was more imaginary conversations. The board eased forward smoothly, climbing the embankment to the top of the dam. Once on the river, Tally pushed it faster, leaning forward until the river was a shining blur beneath her feet. The board didn't seem to have a speed governor, no safety warning sounded. Perhaps its only limits were the open space in front of her, metal in the ground below, and Tally's feet staying on board. Speed was everything if she was going to make up for the last 4 days in limbo. If Tally showed up too long after her birthday, Shay might realize that her operation had been delayed. From there, she might guess that Tally wasn't an ordinary runaway. The river passed beneath her faster and faster, and she reached the rapids in record time. Drops of spray stung like hailstones when she hit the first falls, and Tally leaned back to slow herself a bit. Still, she was taking the rapids faster than she ever had before. Tally realized that this hoverboard was no ugly toy. It was the real thing. On its front end, a half circle of lights glowed, giving feedback from the board's metal detector, which constantly searched ahead to see if there was enough iron in the ground to stay aloft. The lights stayed on solidly as she climbed the rapids, and Tally hoped that Shay was right about metal deposits being found in every river. Otherwise, this could be a very long trip. Of course, at this speed she wouldn't have time to stop if the lights suddenly went out, which would make it a very short trip. But the lights stayed on, and Tally's nerves were soothed by the roar of white water, the cold slap of spray in her face, the thrill of bending her body through curve after curve in the moon-speckled darkness. The board was smarter than her old one, learning her moves in a matter of minutes. It was like graduating from a tricycle to a motorbike. Scary, but thrilling. Tally wondered if the route to the smoke had a lot of rapids to ride. Maybe this really would be an adventure. Of course, at the end of the journey, there would only be betrayal. Or worse, she would discover that Shay's trust in David had been misplaced, which could mean anything. Probably something horrible. She shivered, deciding not to think about that possibility again. When Tally reached the turnoff, she slowed and turned the board around, taking a last look at the city. It shone brilliantly in the dark valley, so distant that she could blot it out with one hand. In the clear night air, Tally could make out individual fireworks unfolding like bright flowers, everything in perfect miniature. The wild around her seemed so much larger, the churning river full of power, the forest huge with the secrets hidden in its black depths. She allowed herself a long stare at the city lights before she stepped onto shore, wondering when she would see her home again. On the trail, Tally wondered how often she'd have to walk. The trip up the rapids had been the fastest she had ever flown, even quicker than the special circumstances hover car dodging through city traffic. After that rush of speed, carrying the knapsack and board felt like being turned into a slug. But soon enough, the rusty ruins appeared below, and the board's metal detector guided Tally to the natural vein of iron. She rode it down toward the crumbling towers, her nerves growing jumpy as the ruins rose up to blot out the half-moon. The broken buildings surrounded her, the scorched and silent cars passing below. Peering through the empty windows made her feel how alone she was, a solitary wanderer in an empty city. "Take the coaster straight past the gap," she said aloud, an incantation to keep away the rusty ghosts. At least that much of the note was crystal clear. The coaster had to be the roller coaster. When the towering ruins gave way to flatter ground, Tally opened up the hoverboard. Reaching the roller coaster, she took the entire circuit at full speed. Maybe straight past the gap was the only important part of the clue, but Tally had decided to treat the note like a magic spell. Leaving out any part might make the whole thing meaningless. And it felt good to ride fast and hard again, leaving the ghosts of the rusty ruins behind. As she whipped around tight turns and down steep descents, the world whirling around her, Tally felt like something caught in the wind, not knowing which direction the journey would ultimately take her. A few seconds before she took the jump across the gap, the metal detector lights winked out. The board dropped away and her stomach seemed to go with it, leaving a hollow feeling inside. Her suspicion had proved right. At top speed, there hadn't been much warning. Tally flew through the air in the silent darkness, the rush of her passage the only sound. She remembered her first time across the gap, how angry she'd been. A few days later it had turned into a joke between them. Typical ugly stuff. But now Shay had done it again, disappearing like the track below, leaving Tally in a free fall. A count of 5 later, the lights flicked on, and the crash bracelet steadied her as the board reactivated, rising smoothly up under her feet with reassuring solidness. At the bottom of the hill, the track turned, climbing into a steep corkscrew of turns, but Tally slowed and kept going ahead, murmuring, "Straight past the gap." The ruins continued under her feet. Out here they were almost completely submerged, only a few shapeless masses rising through the grasp of vegetation. But the Rusties had built solidly, in love with their wasteful skeletons of metal. The light on the front of her board stayed bright. "Until you find one that's long and flat," Tally said to herself. She had memorized the note backward and forward, but repeating the words hadn't made their meaning any clearer. One what was the question? A roller coaster? A gap? The first would be silly. Where would be the point of a long, flat roller coaster? A long, flat gap? Maybe that would describe a canyon, complete with a handy river at the bottom. But how could a canyon be flat? Maybe 1 meant a 1, like the number. Should she be looking for something that looked like a 1? But a 1 was just a straight line anyway, kind of long and flat already. So was I, the Roman numeral for 1, except for the crossbars on top and bottom, or the dot on the top if it was a small I. "Thanks for the great clue, Shay," Tally said aloud. Talking to herself didn't seem like such a bad idea there in the outer ruins, where the relics of the Rusties struggled against the grip of creeping plants. Anything was better than ghostly silence. She passed concrete plains, vast expanses cracked by thrusting grasses. The windows of fallen walls stared up at her, sprouting weeds as if the earth had grown eyes. She scanned the horizon, looking for clues. There was nothing long and flat that she could see. Peering down at the ground passing below, Tally could hardly make out anything in the weed-choked darkness. She might zoom right past whatever the clue referred to and not even know it, and have to retrace her path in daylight. But how would she know when she'd gone too far? "Thanks, Shay," she repeated. Then she spotted something on the ground and stopped. Through the shroud of weeds and rubble, geometrical shapes had appeared, a series of rectangles in a line. She lowered her board and saw that below her was a track with metal rails and wooden crossbars, like the roller coaster, but much bigger, and it went in a straight line as far as she could see. "Take the coaster straight past the gap until you find one that's long and flat." This thing was a roller coaster, but long and flat. But what's it for? She wondered aloud. What fun was a roller coaster without any turns or climbs? She shrugged. However the Rusties got their kicks, this was perfect for a hoverboard. The track stretched off in two directions, but it was easy enough to tell which one to take. One led back the way she'd come, toward the center of the ruins. The other headed outward, northward, and angling toward the sea. "Cold is the sea," she quoted from the next line of Shay's note, and wondered how far north she was going. Tally brought the hoverboard up to speed, pleased that she'd found the answer. If all of Shay's little riddles were this easy to solve, this whole trip was going to be a breeze. Spagbull. She made good time that night. The track zoomed along beneath her, tracing slow arcs around hills, crossing rivers on crumbling bridges, always headed toward the sea. Twice it took her through other rusty ruins, smaller towns further along in their disintegration. Only a few twisted shapes of metal remained, rising above the trees like skeletal fingers grasping at the air. Burned-out ground cars were everywhere, choking the streets out of town, twisted together in the collisions of the Rusty's last panic. Near the center of one ruined town, she discovered what the long, flat roller coaster was all about. In a nest of tracks tangled up like a huge circuit board, she found a few rotting roller coaster cars, huge rolling containers full of rusty stuff, unidentifiable piles of rust and plastic. Tally remembered now that rusty cities weren't self-sufficient and were always trading with one another when they weren't fighting over who had more stuff. They must have used the flat roller coaster to move trade from town to town. As the sky began to grow light, Tally heard the sound of the sea in the distance, a faint roar coming from across the horizon. She could smell salt in the air, which brought back memories of going to the ocean with Ellie and Sol as a Lidley. Cold as the sea, and watch for breaks, Shay's note read. Soon, Tally would be able to see the waves breaking on the shore. Maybe she was close to the next clue. Tally wondered how much time she'd made up with her new hoverboard. She increased its speed, wrapping her dorm jacket around herself in the pre-dawn chill. The track was slowly climbing now, cutting through formations of chalky rock. She remembered white cliffs towering over the ocean, swarming with seabirds nesting in high caves. Those camping trips with Sol and Ellie felt as if they'd happened 100 years ago. She wondered if there was some operation that could make her back into a Lidley again forever. Suddenly, a gap opened up in front of Tally, spanned by a crumbling bridge. An instant later, she saw that the bridge didn't make it all the way across, and there was no river full of metal deposits beneath it to catch her, just a precipitous drop to the sea. Tally spun her board sideways into a skid, her knees bent under the force of braking, her grippy shoes squealing as they slipped across the riding surface, her body turning almost parallel to the ground. But the ground was gone. A deep chasm opened up under her, a fissure cut into the cliffs by the sea. Boiling waves crashed into the narrow channel, their white caps glowing in the darkness, their hungry roars reaching her ears. The board's metal detector lights flickered out one by one as Tally left the splintered end of the iron bridge behind. She felt the board lose purchase, slipping downward. A thought flashed through her mind. If she jumped now, she could make a grab for the end of the broken bridge, but then the hoverboard would tumble into the chasm behind her, leaving her stranded. The board finally halted in its slide out into midair, but Tally was still descending. The last fingers of the crumbling bridge were above her now, out of reach. The board inched downward, metal detector lights flickering off one by one as the magnets lost their grip. She was too heavy. Tally slipped off the knapsack, ready to hurl it down. But how could she survive without it? Her only choice would be to return to the city for more supplies, which would lose 2 more days. A cold wind off the ocean blew up the chasm, goose-pimpling her arms like the chill of death. But the breeze buoyed the hoverboard, and for a moment she neither rose nor fell. Then the board started to slip downward again. Tally thrust her hands into the pockets of her jacket and spread her arms, making a sail to catch the wind. A stronger gust struck, lifting her slightly, taking some weight off the board, and one of the metal detector lights flickered stronger. Like a bird with outstretched wings, she began to rise. The lifters gradually regained purchase on the track until the hoverboard had brought her level with the broken end of the bridge. She coaxed it carefully back over the cliff's edge, a huge shiver passing through her body as the board passed over solid ground. Tally stepped off, legs shaking. "Cold as the sea, and watch for breaks," she said hoarsely. How could she have been so stupid, speeding up just when Shay's note said to be careful? Tally collapsed onto the ground, suddenly dizzy and tired. Her mind replayed the chasm opening up, the waves below smashing indifferently against the jagged rocks. She could have been down there, battered again and again until there was nothing left. This was the wild, she reminded herself. Mistakes had serious consequences. Even before Tally's heart had stopped pounding, her stomach growled. She reached into her knapsack for the water purifier, which she'd filled at the last river, and emptied the muck trap. A spoonful of brown sludge that it had filtered from the water glopped out. "Ew," she said, opening the top to peer in. It looked clear, and smelled like water. She took a much-needed drink, but saved most to make dinner, or breakfast, whatever it was. Tally planned to do most of her traveling at night, letting the hoverboard recharge in sunlight, wasting no time. Reaching into the waterproof bag, she pulled out a food packet at random. "Spag bowl," she read from the label and shrugged. Unwrapped, it looked and felt like a finger-sized knot of dried yarn. She dropped it into the purifier, which made burbling noises as it came to a boil. When Tally glanced out at the glowing horizon, her eyes opened wide. She'd never seen dawn from outside the city before. Like most Uglies, she was rarely up early enough, and in any case, the horizon was always hidden behind the skyline of New Prettytown. The sight of a real sunrise amazed her. A band of orange and yellow ignited the sky, glorious and unexpected, as spectacular as fireworks, but changing at a stately, barely perceptible pace. That's how things were out here in the wild, she was learning. Dangerous or beautiful, or both. The purifier pinged. Tally opened the top and looked inside. It was noodles with a red sauce, with small kernels of soy meat, and it smelled delicious. She looked at the label again. Spag bowl. Spaghetti bolognese. She found a fork in the knapsack and ate hungrily. With the sunrise warming her and the crash of the sea rumbling below, it was the best meal she'd had for ages. The hoverboard still had some charge left, so after breakfast she decided to keep moving. She reread the first few lines of Shay's note. "Take the coaster straight past the gap until you find one that's long and flat, cold as the sea, and watch for breaks. At the second, make the worst mistake." If the second meant a second broken bridge, Tally wanted to run into it in daylight. If she'd spotted the gap a split second later, she would have ended up so much spag bowl at the bottom of the cliffs. But her first problem was getting across the chasm. It was much wider than the gap in the roller coaster, definitely too far to jump. Walking looked like the only way around. She hiked inland through the scrubby grass, her legs grateful for a stretch after the long night on board. Soon the chasm closed, and an hour later she had hiked back up the other side. Tally flew much slower now, her eyes fixed ahead, daring only an occasional glimpse at the view around her. Mountains rose up on her right, tall enough that snow capped their tops even in the early autumn chill. Tally had always thought of the city as huge, a whole world in itself. But the scale of everything out here was so much grander and so beautiful. She could see why people used to live out in nature, even if there weren't any party towers or mansions, or even dorms. The thought of home, however, reminded Tally how much her sore muscles would love a hot bath. She imagined a giant bathtub like they had in New Pretty Town, with whirlpool jets and a big packet of massage bubbles dissolving in it. She wondered if the water purifier could boil enough water to fill a tub in the unlikely event that she found one. How did they bathe in the smoke? Tally wondered what she'd smell like when she arrived, after days without a bath. Was there soap in the survival kit? Shampoo? There certainly weren't any towels. Tally had never realized how much stuff she'd needed before. The second break in the track came up after another hour, a crumbling bridge over a river that snaked down from the mountains. Tally came to a controlled stop and peered over the edge. The drop wasn't as bad as the first chasm, but it was still deep enough to be deadly. Too wide to jump. Hiking around it would take forever. The river gorge stretched away with no easy way down in sight. At the second, make the worst mistake, she murmured. Some clue. Anything she did right now would be a mistake. Her brain was too tired to handle this, and the board was short on power anyway. Mid-morning, it was time to sleep. But first she had to unfold the hoverboard. The special who'd instructed her had explained that it needed as much surface area in the sun as possible while it recharged. She pulled the release tabs and it came apart. It opened like a book in her hands, becoming 2 hoverboards. Then each of those opened up, and then those, unfolding like a string of paper dolls. Finally, Tally had 8 hoverboards connected side to side, twice as wide as she was tall, no thicker than a stiff sheet of paper. The whole thing fluttered in the stiff ocean breeze like a giant kite, though the board's magnets kept it from blowing away. Tally laid it flat, stretched out in the sun, where its metallic surface turned jet black as it drank in solar energy. In a few hours it would be charged up and ready to ride again. She just hoped it would go back together as easily as it had pulled apart. Tally pulled out her sleeping bag, yanked it out of its pack, and wriggled inside, still in her clothes. Pajamas, she added to the list of things she missed about the city. She made a pillow of her jacket, struggled out of her shirt, and covered her head with it. She could already feel a hint of a burn on her nose, and realized she had forgotten to stick on a sunblock patch after daybreak. Perfect. A little red and flaking skin should go quite nicely with the scratches on her ugly face. Sleep didn't come. The day was getting warm, and it felt weird lying there in the open. The cries of seabirds rang in her head. Tally sighed and sat up. Maybe if she had a little more to eat. She pulled out food packets one by one. The labels read, Spag Bowl, Spag Bowl, Spag Bowl, Spag Bowl, Spag Bowl. Tally counted 41 more packets, enough for 3 Spag Bowls a day for 2 weeks. She leaned back and closed her eyes, suddenly exhausted. Thank you, Dr. Cable. A few minutes later, Tally was asleep. The worst mistake. She was flying, skimming the ground with no track under her, not even a hoverboard, keeping herself aloft by sheer willpower and the wind in her outspread jacket. She skirted the edge of a massive cliff that overlooked a huge black ocean. A flock of seabirds pursued her, their wild screams beating at her ears like Dr. Cable's razor-edged voice. Suddenly, the stony cliffs beneath her cracked and fissured. A huge rift opened up, the ocean rushing in with a roar that drowned the seabird's cries. She found herself tumbling through the air, falling down toward the black water. The ocean swallowed her, filling her lungs, freezing her heart so that she couldn't cry out. "No!" Tally shouted, sitting bolt upright. A cold wind off the sea struck her face, clearing her head. Tally looked around, realizing that she was up on the cliffs, tangled in her sleeping bag. Tired, hungry, and desperate to pee, but not falling into oblivion. She took a deep breath. The seabirds still cried around her, but in the distance. The last dream had been only one of many falling nightmares. Night was coming. the sun setting over the ocean, turning the water blood red. Tally pulled her shirt and jacket on before daring to emerge from the sleeping bag. The temperature seemed to be dropping by the minute, the light fading before her eyes. She hurried to get ready to go. The hoverboard was the tricky part. Its unfolded surface had gotten wet, covered with a fine layer of ocean spray and dew. Tally tried to wipe it off with her jacket sleeve, but there was too much water and not enough jacket. The wet board folded up easily enough, but it felt too heavy when she was done, as if the water was still trapped between the layers. The board's operation light turned yellow, and Tally looked closely. The sides of the board were gradually oozing the water away. Fine, gives me time to eat. Tally pulled out a packet of spag bowl, then realized that her purifier was empty. The only ready source of water was at the bottom of the cliff, and there was no way down. She wrung out her wet jacket, which produced a few good squooshes, then scraped off handfuls of the water oozing from the board until the purifier was half full. The result was a dense, overspiced spag bowl that required lots of chewing. By the time she was done with the unhappy meal, the board's light had turned green. "Okay, ready to go," Tally said to herself. But where? She stood still, pondering, one foot on the board and one on the ground. Shay's note read, "At the second, make the worst mistake." Making a mistake shouldn't be that hard. But what was the worst mistake? She'd almost killed herself once today already. Tally remembered her dream. Falling into the gorge would count as a pretty bad mistake. She stepped onto the board and edged it to the crumbling end of the bridge, looking down to where the river met the sea far below. If she climbed down, her only possible path would be to follow the river upstream. Maybe that's what the clue meant. But the steep cliff showed no obvious path, not even a handhold. Of course, a vein of iron in the cliff might carry her down safely. Her eyes scanned the walls of the gorge, searching for the reddish color of iron. A few spots looked promising, but in the growing darkness she couldn't be certain. Tally realized that she'd slept too long. Waiting for dawn would be 12 hours lost, and she didn't have any more water. The only other option was to hike upriver atop the cliff, but it might be days before she reached a place to climb down, and how would she see it at night? She had to make up time, not blunder around in the dark. Tally swallowed, coming to a decision. There had to be a way down on her board. Maybe she was making a mistake, but that's what the clue called for. She edged the board off the bridge until it began to lose purchase. It slipped down the cliffside, descending faster as it left the metal of the track behind. Tally's eye searched desperately for any sign of iron in the cliff. She eased the board forward, bringing it closer to the wall of stone, but saw nothing. A few of the board's metal detector lights flickered out. Any lower, and she was going to fall. This wasn't going to work. Tally snapped her fingers. The board slowed for a second, trying to climb, but then shivered and continued to descend. Too late. Tally spread her jacket, but the air in the gorge was still. She spotted a rusty-looking streak in the wall of stone and coaxed the board closer, but it turned out to be just a slimy smear of lichen. The board slipped downward faster and faster, the metal detector lights flickering out one by one. Finally, the board went dead. Tally realized that this mistake might be her last. She fell like a rock, down toward the crashing waves. Just like in her dream, her voice felt choked by a freezing hand, as if her lungs were already filled with water. The board tumbled below her, spinning like a falling leaf. Tally closed her eyes, waiting for the shattering impact of cold water. Suddenly, something grabbed her by the wrists and yanked her up cruelly, spinning her in the air. Her shoulders screamed with pain, and she spun once all the way around like a gymnast on the rings. Tally opened her eyes and blinked. She was being lowered onto the hoverboard, which waited rock steady just above the water. What the? She wondered aloud. Then, as her feet came to rest, Tally realized what had happened. The river had caught her. It had been dumping metal deposits there for centuries, or however long rivers lasted, and the board's magnets had found purchase just in time. Saved, more or less, Tally muttered. She rubbed her shoulders, which ached from being caught by the crash bracelets, and wondered how far you had to fall before the bracelets would rip your arms out of their sockets. But she'd made it down. The river stretched out in front of her, winding its way into the snow-capped mountains. Tally shivered in the ocean breeze and pulled her soggy jacket tighter around her. 4 days later, take the side you despise. She quoted Shay's note. 4 days. Might as well get started. After her first sunburn, Tally stuck a sunblock patch onto her skin every morning at dawn. But even with only a few hours in the sun each day, her already brown arms gradually deepened in color. Spagbowl never again tasted as good as it had the first time on the cliffs. Tally's meals ranged from decent to odious. The worst were spagbowl breakfasts around sunset, when the mere thought of more noodles made her never want to eat again. She almost wished she would run out of this stuff and be forced to either catch a fish and cook it or simply starve, losing her ugly fat the hard way. What Tally really dreaded was running out of toilet paper. Her only roll was already half gone, and she rationed it strictly now, counting the sheets, and every day she smelled a little worse. On the 3rd day up the river, she decided to take a bath. Tally awoke an hour before sunset, as usual, feeling sticky inside the sleeping bag. She'd washed her clothes that morning and let them dry on a rock. The thought of getting into clean clothes with dirty skin made her flesh crawl. The water in the river was fast moving and left almost nothing in the muck trap of the purifier, which meant it was clean. It was icy cold, though, probably fed by melting snow in the approaching mountains. Tally prayed it would be slightly less freezing late in the day after the sun had had a chance to warm it up. The survival kit did have soap, it turned out, a few disposable packets tucked into a corner of the knapsack. Tally clenched one in her hand as she stood at the edge of the river, wearing nothing but the censer clipped to her belly ring, shivering in the cold breeze. "Here we go," she said, trying to keep her teeth from chattering. She put one foot in and jumped back from the icy streak of agony that shot into her leg. Apparently there would be no easing slowly into the water. She had to take a running jump. Tally walked along the riverbank, searching for a good place to leap in, slowly gathering her courage. She realized she'd never been naked outside before. In the city, everywhere outdoors was public, but she hadn't seen another human face for days. The world seemed to belong to her. Even in the cool air, the sun felt wonderful on her skin. She clenched her teeth and faced the river, standing here pondering the wild wasn't going to get her clean. Just a few steps and a leap, and gravity would do the rest. She counted down from 5, then counted down from 10, neither of which worked. Then she realized that she was getting cold just standing there. Finally, Tally jumped. The freezing water closed like a fist around her. It paralyzed every muscle, turning her hands into shivering claws. For a moment, Tally wondered how she would make it back to shore. Maybe she would just expire here, slipping under the icy water forever. She took a deep, shuddering breath, reminding herself that the people before the Rusties must have taken baths in freezing streams all the time. Tally clenched her teeth to stop them chattering and dipped her head under the water and out, whipping wet hair onto her back. A few moments later, an unlikely kernel of warmth ignited in her stomach, as if the icy water had activated some secret reserve of energy within her body. Her eyes opened wide, and she found herself whooping with excitement. The mountains, towering above her after 3 nights' travel inland, seemed suddenly crystal clear, their snowy peaks catching the last rays of the setting sun. Tally's heart pounded fiercely, her blood spreading unexpected warmth throughout her body. But the burst of energy was burning quickly. She fumbled the soap packet open, squishing it between her fingers, across her skin and into her hair. Another dunking, and she was ready to get out. Looking back at the shore, Tally realized that she'd been carried away from her camp by the river's current. She swam a few strokes upstream, then trudged toward the rocky shore. Waist high in the water, already shivering from the breeze on her wet body, Tally heard something that made her heart freeze. Something was coming. Something big.